Hello, this is Ryan Johnson, one of the coordinators for Orange County, California. It's been over a year since the last podcast I did about the crucible of free market forces that ravage a community of slum dwellers, as poetically described in Behind the Beautiful Forevers. It's too bad the applause for that book didn't spill beyond literary circles to demonstrate the fallacy of choice that free market believers depend on. Since then, I've spent time reading Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, a very revealing text about the constant struggle of those who are impoverished and oppressed in this part of the globe. Also, I read way too many articles about health, sociological trends, tech innovations, and psychology. I'm especially tuned in to articles that appear to reveal new insights into the process of social and individual transformation. As an activist, I'm always asking myself how I can be more effective as an advocate for social transformation, which hinges on individuals experiencing a re-envisioning of their values. In this podcast, I want to present an article that deserves attention. I could ask everyone to just read it, of course, but I'm hoping that narrating it here, with very few edits, will help share the message more broadly. The article first appeared in, or I'm not sure if it first appeared, but it did appear in Contributoria, so that's Contributoria, and it's the title of the article is Can Rational Arguments Actually Change People's Minds? So I'm going to narrate it now and discuss it a little bit after I'm finished. So let me begin. Are we, the human species, unreasonable? Do rational arguments have any power to sway us, or is it all intuition, hidden motivations, and various other forms of prejudice? The answer isn't simple, but we may not be irrational creatures after all. The question has been hanging over me because of my profession. I work as a cognitive psychologist, researching and teaching how people think. My job is based on rational inquiry, yet the picture of human rationality painted by our profession can seem pretty bleak. Every week I hear about a new piece of research which shows up some quirk of our minds, like the one about people given a heavy clipboard judge public issues as more important than people given a light clipboard, or that more attractive people are judged as more trustworthy, or the arguments they give as more intelligent. Commentators and popularizers of this work have been quick to pick up on these findings. Dan Ariely has a book calling us predictably irrational, and the introduction tells us, we are pawns in a game whose forces we largely fail to comprehend. We usually think of ourselves with ultimate control over the decisions we make, but this perception has more to do with our desires than reality. Cordelia Fine's book, A Mind of Its Own, has the subtitle, How Your Brain Distorts and Deceives, whilst David McRaney doesn't pull any punches with the title of his, You Are Not So Smart. The science and those who promote it seem to be saying that we're unreasonable creatures. That's a problem given that many of our social institutions, such as democracy, are based on an assumption that rational persuasion can occur. If I believed the story told in these books, I would be forced to choose between my profession as a cognitive scientist and political commitment as a citizen and Democrat. Fortunately, as a cognitive science, I don't have to believe what I'm told about human nature. I can look into it myself. So I set out to get to the bottom of the evidence on how we respond to rational arguments. Does rationality lose out every time to irrational motivations? Or is there any hope to those of us who want to persuade because we have good arguments, not because we are handsome or popular or offer heavy clipboards? One of the most famous examples of the way our minds twist arguments is an experiment performed by Charles Lord Lee Ross and Mark Lepper way back in 1979. These American social psychologists recruited participants who had views for or against the death penalty. They then presented them with reports of studies which seemed to support or oppose the death penalty. Here's a pro-death penalty example. Kroner and Phillips, 1977, compared murder rates for the year before and the year after adoption of capital punishment in 14 states. In 11 of the 14 states, murder rates were lower after adoption of the death penalty. This research supports the deterrent effect of the death penalty. Lord and colleagues found that people didn't change their minds in the direction of the arguments presented to them. Far from it. Rather, people who had pro-death penalty views found flaws and biases in the anti-death penalty studies, and vice versa. The participants in the experiment ended up with more extreme views than they started with, the pro-people becoming more pro and the anti-people becoming more anti. This biased assimilation effect, whereby we only believe evidence that fits with what we already believe, is no historical artifact. Adam Corner and colleagues from the University of Cardiff showed in 2012 that this bias holds for a very contemporary topic, climate change. People who were more skeptical about climate change rated editorials supporting the reality and importance of climate change as less persuasive and reliable than those people who were less skeptical. At first glance, evidence like this looks like a triumph for the "we're all irrational" team. And don't be tempted to dismiss this as evidence that the people in the experiment are bad thinkers or somehow not qualified to think about the topic. Another recent study showed that the more scientific education a climate skeptic had, the stronger their skepticism was likely to be. But I want to persuade you that this evidence of the power of reason, not unreason. Psychologists perform their interventions on participants who are far from a blank slate. They are all adults, usually university educated, all probably having spent years developing their opinions about the world. It is not really surprising that their views can't be dislodged with a few choice anecdotes. Who would want opinions if they were shifted by the slightest counter-argument? That's not rationality. To really look at the power of reason, we need to look at the effect of strong rather than weak arguments. Unfortunately, as two leading researchers wrote in a 1998 review, relatively little is known about what makes an argument persuasive. 2 decades earlier, one of the authors of this report, Richard Petty, had been involved in a piece of research which showed an important qualification you need to take account of if you want to measure how persuasive good arguments can be. Along with John Cacioppo, Petty ran an experiment looking at how involvement in an issue affected the power of arguments to persuade. The experimenters tried to persuade undergraduates at the University of Missouri that university regulations should be changed so that all students would have to pass an additional comprehensive exam before being allowed to graduate. Previous work had revealed that such a change was strongly counter-attitudinal for most college students. That's psychology code for they hated the idea. Cacioppo and Petty varied the kinds of arguments they used on their volunteers. Half received strong arguments in favor of the change, and half weak arguments that had obvious flaws or simple counter-arguments. A second factor was manipulated: how involved people felt in the argument. Half the volunteers were told that this change was under consideration for the University of Missouri. In other words, that it would affect them, possibly requiring them to pass an extra exam or flunk their degree. The other half were told that the change was being considered at North Carolina State University, which is approximately 1,000 miles away. The results show that when people have low involvement in an argument, neither the strong or weak arguments were persuasive. People's minds were made up, and no argument shifted them. But in the high involvement condition, both the strong and weak arguments had a significant effect. Weak arguments entrenched people's positions. They shifted their attitude to be more against the final exam. Strong arguments, however, had the effect you might expect from reasonable people. They shifted their attitudes to be less against the final exam idea. It still wasn't very popular, but it was less unpopular. This research and research that followed on from it show that strong arguments can be persuasive, but only when people are motivated to deliberate on the issue. Recently, a team led by Joseph Paxton of Howard University showed that in the domain of moral arguments, strong arguments were only persuasive if people were given some deliberation time before being forced to answer. Like crimes, it seems, reasoning requires both motive and opportunity, but if both are there, even in crude psychology experiments, we can show that strong arguments persuade. The strongest evidence on the power of argument comes from domains where there is a right answer. For public issues like the death penalty or moral arguments, it will never be clear what the right answer is. Because of this, one person's strong argument won't be the same as another's. In logic or mathematics, however, because a correct answer can be defined precisely, so can strong arguments. For a long time, psychologists have used a logic task called the Wason selection task as a lens on our power of reasoning. The task works like this. Imagine there are cards which always have a letter on one side and a number on the other. You are shown, flat on the table, 4 cards. Their up-facing sides show the letter E, G, and then the numbers 7 and 6. And you are told that you need to test this rule. All cards with a vowel on one side have an even number on the other side. Which cards do you need to turn over to test if this rule is true? In experiments using this task, over 80% of people test the rule by picking the card showing E and 6, and they are wrong. The result is often held up as an example of the weakness of our powers of logic, showing how unsuited our minds are to formal reasoning. The correct answer is that you need to turn over the E and the 7 cards. If the E card doesn't have an even number on the other side, the rule is false. A vowel did not lead to an even number. Similarly, if the card 7 has a vowel on the other side, the rule has also been shown to be false. A vowel led to a non-even number. Turning over the 6 card doesn't tell you anything, since the rule doesn't say anything about what even-numbered cards ought to have on the other side, i.e., it doesn't say that non-vowels can't lead to even numbers too. But what is often held up as testimony to our irrationality can also be a laboratory for examining our rationality. Whilst the selection task is normally completed by individuals, you can also ask small groups to try and solve the task. When you do this, 2 remarkable things happen. Firstly, the success rate jumps massively so that most groups solve the task correctly, 75% or more, compared to a success rate of less than 10% for individuals. Secondly, we can observe the process of discussion that generates the correct solutions, enabling us to discern something powerful and encouraging about group reasoning. Transcripts of group reasoning about the selection task show that in the process of discussion, groups manage to construct arguments in favor of the correct answer, i.e., the answer that is in line with the logic of hypothesis testing. Other work on group reasoning, this time using mathematical problems, has shown that often it is enough for a single member of the group to realize the correct answer for the group to submit this as their final decision. This truth wins scenario is in total contrast to what psychologists will normally tell you about group function. In most domains, from creativity to tug-of-war, a phenomenon called social loafing holds, whereby the performance of the group is less than the sum of expected effect of individuals acting alone. This encouraging story about the power of reason needs to be put in the context of the research on persuasion. The groups in these experiments have a common goal, and we must assume trust each other and are committed to the task. Furthermore, the solutions can be demonstrated to be correct. In these circumstances, a rational argument is productive. Another result that comes from analyzing transcripts of these types of experiments is that people are only persuaded when they can be shown that the answer they are currently advocating is wrong. Insight into how to do this comes from experiments on the so-called illusion of explanatory depth. The illusion concerns our beliefs about how well we understand complex systems, ranging from the forces driving global terrorism to how a flush toilet works. The original research which framed the phenomenon asked people to self-rate their understanding of how things work. The volunteers were asked to rate how well they understood things like how a speedometer works, how a helicopter flies, or how a cylinder lock opens with a key. After they gave these ratings, the participants were asked to write out a full explanation of how the items actually worked. They then answered test questions about their understanding. They then rated their original understandings again. After trying to provide explanations, participants' ratings of understanding dropped. After the test questions, they dropped even further, revealing that most people have a far less confident understanding of these things than they initially believe. There is a lesson here for all of us about overconfidence. The authors of the study, Leonid Rosenblit and Frank Kyle from Yale University, ascribe the effect to the ease with which we interact with these systems, allowing us to directly appreciate their effects. Example, we make the car go faster and the speedometer shows the new speed. We, they argue, then mistake this sampling of the environment for our own knowledge. Without the working system in front of us, we're actually pretty ignorant of its internal operation. But for me, the interesting lesson is that the study participants came to realize they were wrong in their original assessments. Although full of confidence initially, they moved to re-rating their understanding as dramatically lower. They were, in other words, persuaded to change their minds about something, in this case, about how much they knew. How did this happen? Follow-up work published last year confirms that asking people to provide mechanistic explanations can play a vital role in persuading them they are mistaken. Philip Fernbach of the University of Colorado and colleagues asked participants in an experiment to provide opinions on policies which are generally contentious in the United States, things like health care, Social Security, and tax. So, for example, they indicated their support for policies such as transitioning to a single-payer healthcare system. Whether they were for or against the policy, the average participant was a long way from neutral. Half were then asked to give reasons why they felt like they did, and the other half were asked to give an explanation of how the policy would have effects. Both groups then re-rated their position for or against the policy, and these after scores were compared with the before scores. The reasons group didn't shift their views at all, remaining just as entrenched in their positions for or against as when they started the experiment. The explanations group did change, on average becoming more moderate in their positions. The authors conclude that the illusion of explanatory depth supports political extremism, and that when we are asked to provide explanations for how we think the world works, some of that illusion evaporates, undermining our previous certainty. This research goes some way to explaining why causal reasons have been found to be more persuasive than statistical ones. In this case, arguing that you cannot catch AIDS from touching someone with AIDS because transmission occurs via HIV and bodily fluids, compared to arguing that you cannot catch AIDS from touching someone with it because no one ever has. This raises the general topic of how we react to arguments. More recent research has shown that even children as young as 3 prefer an argument that uses reasons to a circular argument. So it seems that despite all the biases we're subject to, we are sensitive to reason. We discriminate better arguments from worse ones, often recognize the truth when it can be demonstrated, and adjust the strength of our beliefs when we discover we can't justify them as fully as we thought. Other work has shown that the skill of recognizing and developing arguments can be taught. A movement called deliberative polling uses group discussion as a way of measuring people's opinions, rather than stop them in the street and get a knee-jerk reaction strategy. Typically, this approach gathers less extreme views. For example, people's opinions on the value of prisons as a way of treating crime are more moderate, less in favor, as well as leaving participants better informed, more willing to compromise, and more aware of nuances in the issue debated. These successes of group reason are in stark contrast to the known weaknesses of individual reasoning, which is beset with a susceptibility to logical fallacies, as we saw in the Wason selection task, and biases such as confirmation bias. So striking is the success of reason when deployed in the service of argument that 2 cognitive scientists, Dan Sperber and Hugo Mercier, have even proposed that this is what reason evolved to do: convince other people in arguments, a legacy of our biological nature to live in social groups. This explains the success of groups on problems that confound individuals, and also explains why we are so good at thinking up reasons why we're right, even when we're wrong. If the purpose of reason is to persuade others that we're right, rather than find the truth directly, then this is just what you would expect. This theory connects with that of another important theorist of rationality, Jonathan Haidt. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Haidt argues that intuitions come before reasons in arguments about moral issues, and that our social natures mean that it is next to impossible to persuade someone under conditions of group competition, such as the current conditions of U.S. politics. Haidt isn't saying that we can't persuade other people in arguments about moral issues, just that reason and argument are less important than group membership and intuition. If you're interested in irrationality and persuasion, then the very first place to start is the book Influence by social psychologist Robert Cialdini. This classic work looks at 6 major factors which can help persuade other people. For example, one major factor is reciprocity, whereby we feel compelled to give something back when people have given something to us. For example, when a car salesperson has agreed to cut the price by 10%, maybe we feel we should raise the amount we're willing to pay in return. There's no need to labor the opportunities for the unscrupulous to take advantage of this kind of habit of mind. None of Cialdini's important persuasion factors are rational argument. So at first glance, it looks as if Cialdini's manual of persuasion is coming firmly from the we're irrational side. But a second look might give us pause. Much of the evidence on which the power of these factors to aid persuasion is based assumes a situation where you have an at least halfway rational argument to begin with. A closer look at the factors Cialdini highlights shows that some of them are things we would expect to be possessed by someone whose thinking was generally rational. For example, one of Cialdini's principles is the need for people to appear consistent, so that if people first say they support protecting the environment, for example, they are then far more likely to agree to donate money to a green charity. But although our desire to be consistent can tie us in knots, for a reasoning person it is far preferable to the alternative, which is to revel in inconsistency and to feel no compulsion to avoid contradiction. Other persuasion factors highlighted by Cialdini are things which, you could argue, naturally accrue to someone who is more rational. They are more likable, have more authority, and more likely to gather social proof. Lots of people will agree with them. Maybe relying on these factors to judge whether you should be persuaded can lead to irrational mistakes, but in the long term they might help you distinguish more rational from less rational arguments. Paul Bloom is a proponent of the power of reasoning in moral persuasion, arguing that we have direct evidence of the power of reasoning in cases where morality has changed. Over time, people have been persuaded to accept gay marriage, for example, or to reject slavery. Reasoning may not be as fast as intuition, as Haidt claims, but it can play a role in where those intuitions come from. So, are we rational or not? Where does this leave us? Are we a rational animal, or as Robert Heinlein said, merely a rationalizing one? Sure, there's no shortage of evidence that our intuitions, emotions, prejudices, and motivations can push reason around. Good luck to you if you want to use only argument to persuade. Unless you've got people who already like you or trust you, ideally both, you're going to have a hard time. But amidst the storm and shouting of psychological factors, reason has a quiet power. People do change each other's minds, and if you can demonstrate the truth of your point of view or help someone come to realize the shortcoming of theirs, maybe you can shift them along. Now that I've finished reading the article, I want to just highlight a couple of the major points that I thought are relevant to us as activists. The first was that this part of the essay that said, this research and research that followed on from it showed that strong arguments can be persuasive, but only when people are motivated to deliberate on the issue. The way I interpret that is that if we're talking to people, we're doing some outreach work, we really need to give them a chance to think about their position and their explanations in a deeper way so that they don't feel forced to, hurry up and come with an answer. Because when we press people for an answer right away, they don't have that chance to think through it, so they just come up with their canned phrase or, their previous disposition towards that topic. So if it's sustainability, they may already have a preconceived idea and they're just repeating that. So I think that when we're talking to people, it's good to give them some time to one, we ask them a question, but two, we really encourage them to be thoughtful about to think it through, to be thoughtful about their response. In the last few months, Reza, the fellow coordinator here in Orange County, and I have been putting up a whiteboard and asking what we call the question of the day to people that are attending this event that we go to. And it's really interesting because some people just say, they don't know enough to give an opinion. And it's not like this is going to go up in a major news article. It ends up in our newsletter, but it's totally anonymous. But a lot of people feel really insecure about their own knowledge and their own opinions, so they don't even want to write them out. So that's kind of interesting to note because a lot of us are having opinions about things, and much of it isn't deliberate. It's just something that we've been told and we assume it's right, and so we carry on with that same idea. The other point about deliberation that I thought of when I was reading this was maybe there's some kind of processing effect that takes place. So if you're presenting an argument to someone that they had never heard or a different perspective, different paradigm, and they're so unfamiliar with it, they may not seem very accepting right away, but maybe they just need time to process it through. Like, I'm sure you've had the experience where you've heard an argument or you've heard some kind of idea and it just sits with you for a while and it seems somehow immune to distraction, even in our everyday lives. And we just keep ruminating on that idea. And maybe it's because we're working through that idea, what it means, its implications, and it could be quite vast. So when you're doing activism or you're doing outreach somewhere and someone doesn't seem very receptive right away, it may just be because they haven't had time to really think through what you're saying. And it happens a lot when I talk to people. They say, oh, you must have studied this for a long time, or it sounds very complicated. They have responses like that because they're so unfamiliar with what the topic is. I mean, most of the media is focusing either on a tragedy or a sports event, and so to spend so much time thinking about the way our socioeconomic structure works and how it disadvantages people and, you know, all the other social ills that arise from it, it's really beyond the scope of what they talk about in their normal lives and what's presented to them in, you know, public discourse or with their friends. So it could just take some time for it to kind of settle in their mind and to process through what all of that means. The next point that I thought was pretty fascinating was the part where they talked about how people, when they were asked to do the logic task individually, were mostly wrong 80% of the time. But when they worked with a group, their success rate jumped to 75%, which was huge when you compare that 80% were wrong when they were working alone. And I think that tells us something about how we can educate people and to get them to, if we have them in groups, we can have them do problem-solving tasks. And, I mean, I know that's not always possible at outreach events, but maybe there are other venues or other discussions that can happen in which people are asked within a group to come up with ideas that meet a particular need. And I often say when I'm doing outreach that, you know, the Zeitgeist Movement is really asking a design question, which is how do we house, feed, and provide everyone with the water and the basics of life in the most efficient way? And, you know, that it is a design solution, it's not a political solution, and to get them to think about it in that way. And if we could do that in groups, instead of me talking, for example, to one individual and putting them on the spot, but me asking a question in which a group works on it to see which kinds of answers they generate, it may lead them to better solutions or insights into why certain things don't work or won't work. Another extremely important point was when it talked about the groups in these experiments have a common goal, and we must assume trust each other and are committed to the task. This was interesting because in our society we have so much competition and struggle that people do not feel unified. And that's probably why that message of we are one or we're one global family really can help people shift their perspective so that they don't rely so much on, well, I need my family or my nation or my group to do better than another. Instead, to envision, why can't all of us do better together? And when we have that as our goal, the solutions become more apparent because it's not about who's getting what from whom. It's about all of us collaborating together to produce a greater good for all of us. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because if we can somehow connect to people in a way in which they recognize their shared humanity, that may make the arguments in favor of the solutions that are proposed in the Zeitgeist Movement more effective at kind of changing their perspective. The next point that I think is really important to bring up is the part about showing that the answer that someone is coming up with is wrong, and not in a threatening way, but just that it doesn't meet the needs of the explanation that's required for that particular outcome. So I call this process disillusionment, and I tell people that I'm talking to that one of the ways in which we can get people to transform their idea about, you know, society and how it functions, and to escape the confines of this reductionist approach that is very common from free market advocates, is to see that it doesn't quite meet our needs in the way that it should. And I just read an article, in fact, today about a libertarian who is no longer a libertarian, and the way he came to that point of change in himself was when he was drawing the logical conclusions of libertarianism to their extreme. So one of the main principles of libertarian thought besides property rights is the non-aggression principle. And so he found that to abuse your child actively would be a violation of the non-aggression principle. But to starve your child, on the other hand, would not be, because you're not actively hurting them. So you're just withdrawing, doing something for them. So it would be technically okay to starve your child to death because you're not an aggressor. And when he found that, when he found those examples, I mean, there were many more that he gave, but it was just one of the most striking. It caused him to re-examine the explanation of, in this article they talk about explanatory depth. So the explanation behind how that kind of society without any kind of government would function. And he found that it would be sorely lacking in so many areas that it wasn't sufficient to meet the needs of a healthy society. And so if you can kind of focus in on issues that are important to the person you're talking with and show them why their explanation of how the socioeconomic system should work in terms of what they're saying, and it's not working, it may give them pause to be open to hearing a new solution. Because ultimately we're after better results. All of us want to have, greater autonomy, greater health, greater connection with our peers, more recreation, and if we can show that the system that we currently have isn't meeting those needs, then there may be a possibility for disillusionment, which can then lead to the process of transformation. The article goes on to discuss a little bit further about explanations and how when people were just asked to give reasons for their beliefs, they had tons to say and didn't have a change in perspective. But when they were asked to give explanations of how they work, how the policies would work, then there were more moderate answers, and their confidence in a particular solution had changed. So I think that can help us when we're asking people about certain questions, when we're asking people questions about certain issues or certain areas of social failing, that we can ask them to explain how it works. So if they just say, someone's poor and that's because they're lazy, so then why are they lazy? How did they get lazy? Is it natural for people to be lazy? Is it really natural? Have you tried just being lazy all the time? What does that feel like? Or you just burn out? I mean, you can go on and on about trying to see how deep their explanation goes. And maybe at some point they'll just run into a wall and realize, the depth of my explanation isn't very deep and it's not very nuanced. So as such, it's insufficient. So they may be open to learning more ideas or more solutions or a broader perspective about what's causing that problem that you're talking about. The other point I thought about when I was reading the article was also along the same lines of talking about the illusion of explanatory depth, as it's called, is kind of parroting back what they're saying. So it's reminiscent of our popular conception of psychology, in which the patient is lying on the couch and the psychologist says, okay, why are you here? What do you feel? And then the patient says, I'm here because I'm miserable, my life sucks. And then the psychologist says, so how do you feel about having your life suck? Or something along the lines where it just feels like they're just asking the same, they're just repeating back what the patient is saying. But the power of that particular form of questioning is it gives people a chance to reflect on what's coming out of their mouths, because so often we just ramble on and we don't give it a second thought. But by having it reflected back to us, it can make us think a little more deeply about what are my reactions to those things that I'm saying, and what does it seem complete, like coming from another person, does it make as much sense as when it comes from me? And it gives that little space of distance to be slightly more impartial about evaluating the opinions or the beliefs that they hold about a particular topic. And it may be something that you can do when you're talking to people and they're talking about their particular idea, and so you just repeat it back to them, maybe slightly differently, but gauge their response to that. Maybe maybe they won't notice and just be like, yes, that's the right answer, but maybe it will give them pause to consider to consider if their position or if their explanation has enough depth to it to explain why there are so many problems going on, and how maybe try to explain how they're connected. And if they can't find the answer to that, that's where there's an opening for more dialogue about the solutions that are proposed in Zeitgeist Movement. Well, I reached the end of the article. You may have a lot more to think about from what was said, but I just thought it was a really great article for advocates, because our whole purpose is to create that kind of change in perspective, and it can be so frustrating and so difficult, especially when you're meeting people you don't know, and you're trying on the spot to just figure out where they're coming from and what issues may tug at their heartstrings the most. And maybe this will give you some insights into how to relate to them and how to present some of the ideas and solutions that we talk about all the time in the Zeitgeist Movement.